Greetings, fellow Trekkies and Truckers. Well, I look at Deep Space Nine Season 3, now continues on with life support. Jake Sisko is walking along the promenade of Deep Space Nine when old friend Leanne walks up behind him. They reminisce to catch up briefly, and upon Jake discovering that she has stopped seeing Orak, then sets a date for the following evening at the station's Klingon restaurant. Just then, Chief O'Brien and Odo, accompanied by several Bajoran security deputies and Starfleet security officers, come running along the promenade, headed, as it turns out, toward the docking ring. Those men go to an airlock, where they're joined by Dr. Bashir and Nurse Jabara. The chief tells Bashir that the docking Bajoran transport experienced an accident that caused casualties. Bashir says the casualties should have been beamed directly to the infirmary, but the chief explains that the accident caused a plasma coil release of radiation that made transport impossible. Once Odo opens the airlock, injured passengers begin walking through. One of them is Kai Wynn, but she says, "The Vedic! Take care of the Vedic!" Next to her is Vedic Borelli, with a chest covered in third-degree burns, being carried by two security officers. Odo activates his comm badge and apprises Major Kira, the Vedic's companion, of his dire situation. In the infirmary, O'Brien delivers a report to Commander Sisko about the cause of the accident, and Wynn immediately inquires if sabotage might have played a part. Kira acts to that possibility with skepticism, but Kai says that she'll only discuss the possibility in private with the emissary of the prophets, Sisko. In the infirmary's operating room, Dr. Bashir and Jabbar are desperately trying to save Borelli's life. Meanwhile, in Sisko's office, Wynn explains that she and Borelli were en route to peace treaty negotiations with Lieutenant Terrell when the accident occurred. Sisko expresses surprise that Wynn would be anywhere near such proceedings, but she explains that the underlying vision is Borelli's and the credit for the success of negotiations is mostly due to him. However, in the infirmary, Bashir informs Kira that Borelli is dead, having never regained consciousness. After sharing this with Kira, Bashir suggests she take some time off her first officer duties to grieve, but Kira tells him she will do so in her own time. Bashir goes back to the table in which Borelli's body rests, intending to start an autopsy. However, he discovers that Borelli's nervous system is still transmitting electrical signals to his brain. Bashir hypothesizes that Borelli's radiation exposure might have fortified his peripheral cell membranes, and he and Jabbar resume treatment according to the hypotheses, treatment which proves to be successful. Later, Bashir says Borelli should be back on his feet in a few weeks. Both Sisko and the Kai credit Bashir with nothing less than a miracle, according to the Kai, by the grace of the prophets. But Bashir insists that it was simply the best of luck. Borelli is present and conscious, and says he's merely grateful, since it allows him to complete unfinished work. Kai takes that opening to insist that the treaty negotiations must be resumed quickly, but Bashir disagrees on account of Borelli's infirmity. However, the Kai insists that Borelli will merely advise her while she conducts the negotiations, to which Bashir agrees on the condition that Borelli isn't tired out. Meanwhile, Kira looks on the whole proceeding with a gimlet eye. Later, Nog goes to the Sisko's quarters, when Jake tries to explain the date he's got with Leanne and cancel the plans he and Nog had to play dom job with some Terrellians. Nog's hard to reach at first, but finally catches on, and corners Jake into making it a double date. Back in the infirmary, Bashir comes to Borelli's bedside to explain that his treatment caused damage to Borelli's circulatory system and is damaging his in turn. Bashir proposes putting Borelli into stasis for an indeterminate length of time while an effective treatment is researched, but Borelli finds that unacceptable, since it's likely become impossible to conclude the peace treaty as a result. Bashir reluctantly suggests administering experimental drug Cavasokin, emphasizing that there is a 20% chance of damage to Borelli's internal organs. Blake accepts that risk in lieu of being put into stasis. As far as Borelli is concerned, conclusion of the treaty is the will of the prophets, and he's determined to see it through. Later, Legat, Terrell, Kai Wynn, and Commander Sisko in the wardroom continue negotiations, but without much success. They recess, and the Kai complains to Sisko that she's at a severe disadvantage of Borelli's direct involvement. She declares that if he dies, the peace with Cardassia dies with him. Later, Jake, Nog, Leanne, and Riska, who is Nog's date, are sitting at a table in the Braille of Quarks, eating dinner. Nog is interjecting with sensitive comments. "Boy, Jake, she talks a lot for a female," while Jake tries to maintain a normal, respectful flow of conversation. However, Nog's attitude descends to what can be best described as the gutter. Leanne and Riska leave the bar in a huff. The Nog insists that Jake blew it because he was treating my female as if she was an equal. Jake is equally displeased with Nog, and the two of them stumble away angrily as well. In the infirmary, Wynn explains her difficulties to Borelli, but he has an obvious discomfort. Bashir tells her that Borelli's had enough stress, but the Kai insists that she needs more of Borelli's attention. Bashir steps in and tells the Kai that if she doesn't leave, she'll be thrown out by security. And Kira says security won't need to be called, because she'll escort the Kai out of the infirmary herself. Only then does Wynn back down and leave. Bashir explains that the organ damage he'd feared is starting to take place. In order to keep Borelli alive without putting him in stasis, we need to transplant artificial organs to replace the damaged ones. Borelli insists that Bashir does whatever it takes to get him through the negotiations. After performing the transplants, Bashir goes to Kai Wen, who's looking over pads in the wardroom. He explains to the Kai to release Borelli from his obligation to be involved in negotiations. He explains that he wants the Kai to release Borelli from his obligation to be involved in negotiations, since doing so is the only thing that will give Borelli a fighting chance to live. Kai Wen refuses, and Bashir ultimately deduces that in the event negotiations fail, Wynn wants a scapegoat handy. When Bashir starts to leave, Wynn tells him, "And Doctor, I won't forget what you've said here." Bashir definitely tells her he won't either. At their quarters during dinner, Jake is telling his father about the disastrous double date, and Ben's totally unsurprised, since Nog is a Ferengi and burdened by the tunnel vision imposed by Ferengi gender roles. Jake thinks that the cultural differences spell the end of his friendship with Nog, but Ben disagrees and insists that there's a genuine bond between the two that can be restored if the two of them will make up. Jake recalls when his father told him that the differences between humans and Ferengi were too much to overcome. Ben recalls this and admits he was wrong. Jake doubts that Nog is at all willing to speak with him, and Ben suggests he will have to do something to get his attention. Borelli has suffered irreversible brain damage in the meantime. Bashir asks just as Jabbar is trying to stabilize him, and Wynn says he had called her there, straining himself. And when they're saying he had called her there, straining himself. In the station commander's office, Wynn, Cisco, Kira, and Bashir are discussing the situation, and the Kai asks if something can be done to restore Borelli's brain function as well. Bashir says that a positronic implant would give them something to work with, and would cause Borelli's psyche to change in ways those present would find difficult to accept. Kira quickly agrees that it should be tried, since Borelli's last option for seeing the peace treaty through, and Bashir agrees to perform the needed procedure on account of Kira's endorsement. Meanwhile, Jake has come up with an idea that will give Nog no better choice than to speak with him. He goes to security, asking him to arrest him and Nog and put them in the same holding cell. In the infirmary, Bashir has completed the positronic implant and, as he predicted, Borelli is alert, but not at all himself. After some friction and Nog's discovery that Jake put Oda up to their arrest, the two of them finally come to an agreement that there is a bond of friendship between them strong enough to make them forget the differences between their two cultures. However, mending fences turns out to be much easier for the two of them than being properly released from the holding cell. It turns out that the treaty negotiations were a success, and a party is being held in the wardroom to celebrate the event when Bashir gets called back to the infirmary. It turns out the remaining organic half of Borelli's brain is finally failing, and with the peace treaty concluded, the only person with a stake who can see a point to do anything more to keep Borelli alive is Kira, but Bashir finally convinces her to let him go. Kira asks Bashir how long Borelli has before he dies. Bashir tells her he has 3 hours. Kira requests that she be alone with him, and Bashir leaves, bringing Jabbar with him. Kira, alone with the unconscious Borelli, begins telling him about things she never got a chance to tell him before. Recalling meeting him for the first time, she remembers having such a serenity about him. She just assumed he had all the answers, but she soon realized he was as confused as everyone else. He just accepted his confusion better than anyone Kira knew. That was when she realized she loved him. Oh, poor Kira. So let's take a look at some trivia surrounding this episode. This episode marks the death of Vedic Borelli Antos. Philip Anglin later plays the Mirror Universe version of the character in the 6th season episode Resurrection. The Bajoran-Cardassian treaty is signed during this episode. The episode Shakar is a sequel source to this episode. Nog says he doesn't even know what a Tholian looks like. The only Tholian body part previously revealed on screen was the head in the original series episode The Tholian Web. Viewers would not fully know what a Tholian looks like until the Enterprise episode In a Mirror Darkly 10 years later. This episode was the first of Deep Space Nine to be aired after Star Trek Voyager premiered. Oh, nice. So overall, yeah, this is a pretty sad episode, and I do feel kind of bad for what happened to Borelli and how it affected Kira, so yeah. So overall, I give life support 4 warp cores out of 5. Well, anyway, tune in a bit as we take the next episode, Heart of Stone. So, until then, live long and prosper, everybody.